What follows is designed to interrupt you, not gently, not politely, but deliberately, because the state you were in moments ago, scrolling, skimming, half present, is precisely the state in which nothing meaningful ever reaches you. Human attention today is fragmented by design. Your mind is trained to move fast, dismiss quickly, and protect itself from depth by calling everything content. This moment breaks that pattern. Not to flatter you, not to elevate you, and not to place you above anyone else, but to pull you out of automatic motion and return you to conscious awareness. When attention is disrupted sharply, the nervous system pauses. That pause is not accidental. It is the doorway through which clarity enters. Urgency exists here not as panic but as precision. Time pressure is not introduced to scare you but to collapse indecision. When something matters, hesitation becomes the real threat. The insistence that this moment is not random is not a mystical claim meant to intoxicate the ego. It is an observation about probability and alignment. Out of millions of possible moments, you are here now reading this while countless other signals fail to capture your attention. That narrowing is not coincidence in the trivial sense of randomness. It is convergence. Attention always follows relevance even before the mind understands why. The body often knows before language does. That tightening in the chest, that sudden stillness of thought, that sense that something has cut through the noise, these are not supernatural proofs but physiological markers of salience. Your system recognized significance before your beliefs could interfere. Emotional anchoring happens when information lands below narrative and above instinct, in the space where meaning registers as sensation. That is why the body responds first. The framing of this message as protective rather than threatening is essential because fear contracts perception while protection stabilizes it. A threat demands obedience, protection invites responsibility. This distinction matters. Nothing of value grows under coercion. What is being asked of you here is not submission but presence. A sacred moment is not defined by religious language or divine claims, it is defined by exclusivity of attention. When something asks for your full awareness, uninterrupted, undistracted, it becomes set apart from the ordinary flow of experience. Sacredness is a function of focus. This moment claims that status not because it is dramatic, but because it requires you to stop performing, stop escaping, and stop numbing. The exclusivity here is not about being chosen over others. It is about choosing to be fully here rather than elsewhere. That choice carries responsibility. When you give full attention, you are no longer a passive consumer. You become accountable for what you register and how you respond. This is why urgency matters. Not because something bad will happen if you look away, but because insight decays rapidly when deferred. Moments of alignment are fragile. They appear when internal readiness meets external signal, and they vanish when overanalyzed or postponed. The insistence on seriousness is not aesthetic, it is functional. Depth cannot coexist with casual dismissal. This introduction is not asking you to believe anything yet, it is asking you to stay, to remain conscious rather than reflexive, to recognize that unseen choices, internal orientations, and private responses are the architecture of trajectory long before outcomes become visible. Nothing here is about superiority, nothing here is about fantasy. It is about how small, sincere decisions register beyond immediate reward systems and accumulate into directional change. If you continue, it must be with the understanding that attention is not free. What you focus on shapes what you become responsible for. This moment interrupts you, because it must. And whether it becomes meaningful or evaporates depends entirely on whether you remain present or retreat back into noise. The invocation of Archangel Michael functions here not as mythology for entertainment, but as a symbolic compression of authority, protection, and decisive intervention, drawing on a figure that across cultures represents the boundary between chaos and order, fear and resolve, collapse and containment. When Michael is named as messenger, the message is framed as transmission rather than opinion, as delivery rather than persuasion. This immediately shifts the psychological posture of the listener. Instead of evaluating the speaker as an individual with motives, personality, or bias, the listener is invited to perceive the voice as a conduit, something temporarily occupied by a function larger than itself. This fusion of divine authority with the speaker's voice is not subtle, and it is not meant to be. It collapses distance. It removes the buffer that normally allows a listener to remain detached, critical, and safe inside abstraction. In this framing, the words are not presented as ideas to consider later, but as signals arriving in real time, carrying consequence. The claim that higher realms have intervened directly in the viewer's timeline intensifies this effect by recontextualizing the present moment. Time is no longer neutral. The present is no longer just now. It becomes a junction, a crossing point, where trajectories can be altered. By asserting intervention, the narrative removes randomness from the experience and replaces it with intentionality. This is crucial because humans respond very differently to events perceived as accidental versus events perceived as deliberate. Accident invites indifference, intervention demands response. The listener is no longer one among many, they are addressed as a specific node in a larger system, a point at which action or inaction matters. Establishing credibility through spiritual hierarchy further stabilizes this frame. Rather than claiming authority directly, the message appeals upward, referencing layered structures of observation and command. This mirrors how legitimacy functions in human systems. Authority is rarely trusted when it is self-generated, but becomes persuasive when it appears delegated from a higher, more stable source. By placing the speaker beneath Archangel Michael and Michael beneath God, the narrative constructs a vertical chain that feels ordered, ancient, and resistant to individual corruption. The higher the source, the less personal the motive appears. This creates an atmosphere in which questioning the message feels less like healthy skepticism and more like defiance of structure itself. Resistance is subtly reframed, not as intelligence or discernment, but as delay. And delay is framed as dangerous, not because punishment will occur, but because timing is presented as fragile. The risk is not divine anger, the risk is misalignment. Skepticism becomes hesitation, and hesitation becomes loss of momentum at a critical threshold. This is psychologically powerful because it exploits a truth about human experience. Many of our deepest regrets are not about wrong actions, but about moments when we failed to act while something was still alive. By framing skepticism as dangerous hesitation, the message bypasses debates about belief and instead targets fear of missed opportunity. It suggests that clarity has already arrived and that continued analysis will only dull it. The listener is positioned at the edge of something already in motion, not at the beginning of a decision-making process. This removes the comfort of neutrality. One is either aligned with the movement or obstructing it through delay. The protective framing is essential here. Michael is not invoked as a judge, but as a defender. The message insists that intervention occurred to prevent loss, not to enforce obedience. This allows urgency without overt threat. The danger is implied to exist already external to the message itself. The message becomes a shield rather than a weapon. Accepting it feels like stepping under cover. Rejecting it feels like stepping back into exposure. This binary is not presented explicitly, but it is felt. The fusion of voice and authority ensures that emotional weight carries through even if the listener does not consciously endorse the theology. One does not have to believe in angels to feel the psychological pressure of hierarchy, protection, and timing. These are archetypal structures embedded deeply in human cognition. The claim of direct intervention in the timeline also alters self-perception. The listener is no longer merely reacting to life. They are being reacted to by life, noticed, adjusted for, responded to. This can induce a heightened sense of responsibility. If higher systems are paying attention, then one's choices acquire weight. Small decisions are no longer trivial. Silence becomes a response. Inaction becomes a form of action. This is why the message insists on full attention and discourages retreat into doubt. Doubt here is not framed as curiosity, but as disengagement. At the moment, engagement is required. The establishment of unquestionable credibility is less about convincing the rational mind and more about overwhelming it. Hierarchy, urgency, and protection combine to create a container so dense that analytical distance feels inappropriate, almost disrespectful. The listener is nudged out of observer mode and into participant mode. Whether or not the metaphysical claims are accepted, the structure accomplishes its aim. It creates a moment that feels consequential, protected, and irreversible. And within that moment, resistance feels less like autonomy and more like abandonment of one's own potential alignment. Reframing recent life difficulties as intentional interference operates primarily as a meaning-making mechanism rather than a factual claim about invisible enemies, and it is important to understand how and why this reframing works without confusing narrative relief with literal causation. When people experience prolonged difficulty, confusion delays reversals, fear without a clear source, the mind searches for coherence. Human cognition is not distressed most by pain itself, but by pain that feels random, directionless, or meaningless. Normal stressors such as bureaucratic delays, relational tension, financial instability, health uncertainty, or internal exhaustion are complex phenomena with multiple interacting causes. However, complexity is cognitively expensive. It demands patience, ambiguity, tolerance, and sustained analysis, all of which are depleted under stress. In this depleted state, the nervous system prefers a single organizing explanation over an accurate but fragmented one. Recasting difficulty as intentional interference provides that organizing frame. It transforms chaos into pattern. Instead of asking, why is everything so disjointed, the mind is offered, something is pushing against me because I am moving toward something that matters. This does not require the interference to be real in an objective sense. It only requires the narrative to reduce uncertainty. Normal stressors become evidence not of personal failure or bad luck, but of resistance. This shift alone can dramatically change emotional experience. Confusion is no longer a sign of incompetence, it becomes a symptom of pressure. Delays are no longer proof of stagnation, they become friction. Fear is no longer weakness, it becomes a signal that something meaningful is at stake. Validation emerges not through solving the problem, but through explaining the feeling. The narrative externalizes blame away from chance randomness or personal inadequacy and relocates it into an external field of opposition. Psychologically, this is relieving. Randomness feels indifferent, complexity feels overwhelming. Opposition, even imagined, feels relational. It implies engagement. It suggests that the individual matters enough to be resisted. This can restore a sense of agency when circumstances have eroded it. Instead of being at the mercy of impersonal systems or unpredictable variables, the person becomes a participant in a story where their movement has consequences. Emotional relief arises because the narrative answers an unspoken question: why does this feel so heavy? The answer given is not because life is complicated, but because something is responding to your trajectory. From a psychological standpoint, this reframing functions similarly to stress inoculation. It allows the individual to reinterpret bodily and emotional signals that would otherwise trigger collapse. Anxiety becomes vigilance, fatigue becomes endurance, setbacks become tests rather than endpoints. The narrative also normalizes disorientation. When confusion is framed as a sign, it stops being something to fix immediately and becomes something to endure intelligently. This reduces self-criticism. People often suffer twice, once from the difficulty itself and again from judging themselves for not handling it better. A narrative of interference removes the second layer. It says implicitly, anyone under this kind of pressure would feel this way. Delays are particularly destabilizing because they suspend action without resolution. When delays are reframed as intentional obstruction, they become temporary by definition. Obstruction implies eventual passage, random delay does not. Fear similarly becomes less shameful when it is interpreted as a response to perceived threat rather than a personal flaw. Even if the threat is symbolic rather than literal, the nervous system responds to the meaning assigned to sensation. By externalizing blame, the narrative protects identity. Instead of internalizing difficulty as evidence of being broken, unworthy, or incapable, the individual can preserve a coherent self-concept. This preservation is not trivial. Identity collapse is one of the most dangerous consequences of prolonged stress. When people conclude that their struggles mean something is fundamentally wrong with them, motivation and hope erode. A narrative explanation, even a symbolic one, can act as a psychological brace, holding the structure upright long enough for real coping strategies to take effect. It is important, however, to distinguish between narrative utility and literal truth. Interpreting stressors as unseen opposition does not require belief in external enemies. It can be understood as a metaphor for systemic friction, internal resistance, or the natural backlash that occurs when patterns are challenged. Any change in behavior, boundaries, ambition, or self-concept disrupts equilibrium. Systems, including social systems and internal habits, tend to resist disruption. This resistance can feel personal even when it is not. By giving that resistance a narrative form, the mind can engage with it rather than be flattened by it. Emotional relief comes not from denying complexity, but from temporarily simplifying it to restore functional capacity. Once stabilized, a person can return to nuanced analysis. In this sense, the narrative is a transitional scaffold, not a final explanation. It allows the individual to move from helplessness to orientation. The danger arises only when the narrative hardens into literal belief that overrides evidence and isolates the person from corrective feedback. When held lightly as a meaning-making lens, rather than a factual map, reframing difficulty as interference can be psychologically adaptive. It validates lived experience without demanding certainty. It acknowledges pain without assigning moral failure. It offers coherence without requiring omniscience. Most importantly, it provides emotional relief by answering the nervous system's demand for sense-making at a time when raw complexity would be unbearable. Repeated emphasis on narrowing windows and closing opportunities functions as a powerful psychological accelerator, not because time pressure is always real, but because the human nervous system is exquisitely sensitive to perceived scarcity. When a message insists that a window is closing, it shifts the listener out of reflective processing and into survival-oriented decision-making. The mind stops asking, "Is this true?" and starts asking, "What if I miss it?" This is not accidental. Scarcity collapses nuance. It compresses attention, It prioritizes speed over accuracy. In ordinary life, most meaningful choices benefit from discernment, pacing, and integration. But when urgency is framed as spiritual or existential, hesitation itself becomes morally suspect. The listener is no longer deciding between options, they are deciding whether they are the kind of person who responds in time. This reframing subtly converts timing into character. Opportunities are no longer situational, they are tests. Windows do not merely close because conditions change, they close because the individual failed to act correctly when prompted. The introduction of the idea that blessings can be reassigned intensifies this pressure by adding a zero-sum dimension. What was once framed as a personal path becomes a competitive allocation. If you do not step forward now, the narrative implies what was meant for you will go to someone else. This activates loss aversion, one of the strongest drivers of human behavior. People are more motivated to avoid loss than to pursue gain. By suggesting that blessings are transferable and contingent, the message leverages this bias. The listener is pushed to act not from clarity but from fear of dispossession. Importantly, this fear is not framed as anxiety but as consequence. The implication is not you might feel bad if you wait, but you will forfeit something irreversible. This creates pressure to act immediately because delay is equated with permanent loss. There is no allowance for maturation, readiness, or contextual alignment. Time becomes a cliff rather than a continuum. Binding obedience to timing rather than discernment further shifts authority away from the listener's internal sensing and toward the external message. Discernment is slow, embodied, and iterative. It involves checking resonance, observing patterns, and integrating information across time. Obedience to timing, by contrast, is binary. You either move when prompted or you fail the test. This bypasses the individual's capacity to evaluate whether an action is wise, ethical, or sustainable. The instruction is not understand but comply before it's too late. In this framework, discernment is reframed as hesitation, and hesitation is reframed as disobedience. The listener's own uncertainty, which might normally signal the need for more information or grounding, is reinterpreted as resistance. This is a critical shift because it teaches the individual to distrust their own pacing. Over time, repeated exposure to this framing can erode self-trust. People learn to override their internal signals in favor of external cues, especially when those cues are framed as spiritually authoritative. Urgency becomes not just a situational factor, but a moral one. Acting quickly is equated with faithfulness, alignment, or worthiness. Acting slowly is equated with fear, lack, or spiritual dullness. This reinforcement of urgency as a test of worthiness is particularly potent because it ties behavior to identity. The question is no longer, is this the right move, but what does my response time say about me? When worthiness is on the line, the nervous system spikes. Shame and pride become motivators. People act not to choose well, but to avoid being categorized as unchosen, unfaithful, or left behind. The narrowing window narrative also collapses future orientation. If now is the only moment that matters, then reflection on long-term consequences is implicitly discouraged. The listener is trained to value immediacy over sustainability. This can lead to impulsive commitments, overextension, and later regret, which are then often reframed as further tests rather than signals that the initial framing was flawed. The system becomes self-sealing. If acting quickly leads to harm, the harm is interpreted as refinement. If acting slowly leads to missed opportunities, the miss is interpreted as failure. In both cases, the urgency narrative remains intact. Psychologically, this structure offers a strange comfort. It reduces the complexity of life into a series of high-stakes moments that can be won or lost. Ambiguity is replaced with drama. Responsibility is simplified into responsiveness. For individuals who feel stalled, invisible, or uncertain, this can feel energizing. Suddenly, everything matters. Suddenly, delay has meaning. Suddenly, there is a clear reason for discomfort. You are being pressed because something important is happening. However, this energy comes at a cost. Chronic urgency keeps the nervous system in a state of heightened arousal. Over time, this reduces access to creativity, empathy, and deep reasoning. The person becomes reactive rather than responsive. They learn to associate peace with complacency and tension with purpose. This inversion is subtle but profound. Healthy discernment often feels quiet, spacious, and grounded. Manufactured urgency feels tight, constricted, and breathless. When urgency is repeatedly framed as divine timing, the individual may begin to equate inner calm with spiritual failure. The idea that blessings can be reassigned also introduces comparison, even when it is not explicit. If what is meant for you can go to another, then others become implicit rivals. This can erode solidarity and trust. Instead of focusing on one's own readiness and integrity, attention shifts to keeping up, staying alert, and not falling behind. The spiritual or personal path becomes a race rather than a maturation. It is important to note that real opportunities do sometimes have time constraints. Not all urgency is artificial, but authentic urgency is usually contextual and specific. It explains why timing matters in concrete terms. It invites informed choice rather than coerced action. Manipulative urgency, by contrast, is abstract and totalizing. It does not specify mechanisms. It asserts inevitability. It does not invite questions. It warns against them. It does not strengthen discernment. It replaces it. When urgency is framed as a test of worthiness, failure is not simply a missed chance, it is a reflection on the self. This can create a cycle of compliance driven by fear rather than alignment. Over time, individuals may find themselves exhausted, confused, and disconnected from their own sense of agency, even as they believe they are being faithful or responsive. Understanding these dynamics does not require cynicism, it requires clarity. Timing can matter without being weaponized. Opportunities can be finite without being moralized. Action can be encouraged without being coerced. Discernment is not the enemy of movement. It is what makes movement intelligent. When urgency consistently overrides discernment, the cost is paid not immediately but cumulatively, in diminished self-trust and increased dependence on external signals to determine one's worth and direction. The use of intimate language, such as "my child" or "dear one," functions as a rapid emotional bypass that collapses distance and establishes closeness without requiring shared history, and its effectiveness lies in how quickly it signals safety, care, and recognition to the human nervous system. These phrases mirror early attachment language, the kind associated with protection, guidance, and unconditional regard, which immediately lowers defenses and increases receptivity. When a message addresses the listener in this way, it subtly repositions the speaker as a benevolent authority rather than a neutral source of information. The listener is no longer simply consuming content, they are being spoken to. This creates the illusion of being individually known and chosen, even though the message is broadcast identically to many. The illusion works because the human mind interprets direct address as personal relevance. When someone says "you," the brain responds as if singled out regardless of context. Adding affectionate qualifiers intensifies this effect, transforming a general statement into what feels like a private exchange. The claim that the message reached the viewer just in time further sharpens this personalization by aligning the content with the listener's current emotional state. Most people encounter such messages during moments of vulnerability, confusion, or seeking, which makes the timing feel meaningful. By asserting perfect timing, the message reframes coincidence as orchestration. The listener's presence is no longer random, it is evidence of being guided or noticed. This relieves existential anxiety by suggesting that someone or something is paying attention, tracking their journey, and intervening when necessary. Emotional bonding is deepened through reassurance and empathy, especially when the message validates feelings the listener has not voiced aloud. Statements like "you've been carrying so much" or "I know how tired you are" create a sense of being seen without the risk of exposure. The listener does not have to explain themselves. The message appears to already understand. This is powerful because it satisfies the desire for recognition without requiring vulnerability. The bond feels earned, even though it is simulated. Over time, repeated exposure to this dynamic can strengthen emotional attachment to the voice or source of the message because it consistently provides comfort, affirmation, and a sense of belonging. The establishment of a one-to-one relational dynamic is central here. Although the medium is one-to-many, the framing is one-to-one. The speaker adopts the role of an intimate guide, confidant, or protector, and the listener is invited to respond internally as if in a private relationship. This dynamic can feel especially compelling for individuals who lack consistent emotional attunement in their offline relationships. The message fills a relational gap. It speaks with certainty, warmth, and focus, offering what feels like undivided attention. Psychologically, this can regulate distress and restore a sense of coherence, which is why it feels so comforting. However, the same mechanisms that create comfort also reduce critical distance. When a listener feels personally addressed and emotionally held, skepticism can feel like betrayal rather than discernment. Questioning the message may feel equivalent to rejecting care. The authority of the message is reinforced not through evidence, but through intimacy. Because the relationship feels personal, disagreement feels relational rather than intellectual. The just-in-time framing also introduces subtle dependency. If the message arrived precisely when needed, then future guidance may also be expected to arrive externally rather than being cultivated internally. The listener may begin to scan for similar voices to provide reassurance and direction, gradually outsourcing their sense of timing and judgment. The illusion of being chosen can further complicate this because it separates the listener from an imagined majority who wouldn't understand or weren't meant to hear this. This exclusivity strengthens identification with the message while weakening alternative perspectives. Emotional bonding through empathy often includes reframing the listener's pain as meaningful, purposeful, or preparatory. While this can be stabilizing, it can also discourage exploration of practical causes or solutions because the emotional relief comes from interpretation rather than action. The one-to-one dynamic narrows the field of reference. Instead of checking insights against multiple sources' lived experience or trusted relationships, the listener is encouraged to trust the voice that already knows them. This can feel safe, but it subtly shifts the locus of authority outward. Importantly, none of this requires malicious intent to be effective. These techniques mirror natural human bonding strategies used by caregivers, mentors, and spiritual leaders across cultures. The issue is not intimacy itself, but asymmetry. In a real relationship, intimacy develops through mutual exchange, accountability, and the possibility of rupture and repair. In a mediated one-way relationship, intimacy is experienced without reciprocity. The listener gives emotional trust. The source does not risk anything in return. This imbalance can make the bond feel profound while remaining untestable. Over time, the listener may attribute increasing significance to the message because it feels consistently supportive and personally relevant, even though it cannot adapt to their specific circumstances beyond broad generalities. Understanding this dynamic allows the listener to retain the benefits: comfort, reflection, reassurance, without surrendering autonomy. Intimate language can be received as symbolic rather than literal, as an invitation to self-compassion rather than proof of external selection. The sense of being known can be redirected inward, encouraging the listener to develop their own capacity for empathy and attunement. When the illusion is recognized as a psychological effect rather than a metaphysical fact, the relational warmth can still be appreciated without granting unquestioned authority. In this way, the message can serve as a mirror rather than a master, reflecting the listener's needs back to them without replacing their capacity to discern, choose, and ground meaning in their own lived reality. The introduction of betrayal from trusted individuals is a potent narrative device because it activates one of the deepest human fears, the fear that closeness itself is dangerous. Trust is not just an emotional preference, it is a survival strategy. Humans are wired to rely on familiar figures to reduce uncertainty and threat. When a message introduces the idea that those closest to you may secretly oppose you, it destabilizes this strategy and forces a reevaluation of social reality. Betrayal framed in this way does not require evidence, it relies on plausibility. Most people have experienced some form of disappointment, misalignment, or subtle harm from someone they trusted. By invoking betrayal, the message taps into existing memory and emotional residue, making the claim feel immediately credible. The distinction between public smiles and private intentions sharpens this effect by suggesting that danger is not overt but hidden behind politeness and social performance. This framing encourages hypervigilance. Ordinary social ambiguity, which is usually navigated through context and ongoing feedback, is reinterpreted as concealment. A smile is no longer neutral or friendly. It becomes suspect. Kind words are no longer reassuring, they may be strategic. This split between appearance and intention creates a sense that reality has a false surface layer that only the aware can see through. Framing jealousy as spiritual resistance further moralizes this interpretation. Jealousy, which is a common and psychologically understandable response to perceived inequality or threat, is elevated into something more ominous and impersonal. It is no longer just another person's unresolved emotion. It becomes resistance to light growth or alignment. This move absolves the listener from having to consider interpersonal complexity. The other person's behavior does not need to be contextualized, discussed, or negotiated. It is explained by their internal opposition to what the listener represents. This explanation is emotionally efficient. It reduces cognitive load by collapsing multiple possible causes into a single value-laden one. The listener is not rejected because of miscommunication, boundary confusion, or differing needs. They are resisted because they are advancing. Encouragement of emotional distancing from certain relationships follows naturally from this framing. If trusted individuals are potential betrayers and jealousy is evidence of spiritual resistance, then closeness becomes risky. Distancing is reframed not as avoidance or withdrawal, but as wisdom. Emotional separation is no longer a painful or ambiguous choice, it is a protective measure. This is especially compelling for individuals who are already feeling misunderstood or unsupported. The narrative offers permission to disengage without guilt. It reassures the listener that their discomfort around certain people is not relationally inconvenient, but spiritually significant. Positioning separation as divine protection completes the loop. What might otherwise feel like loss, grief, or loneliness is reinterpreted as safeguarding. The pain of distancing is softened by the belief that it is purposeful and externally guided. Instead of mourning the rupture, the listener is encouraged to see it as evidence of care from a higher order. This reframing can provide immediate emotional relief. It transforms relational ambiguity into moral clarity. The listener no longer has to wrestle with mixed feelings or contradictory evidence. The narrative tells them which relationships are safe and which are not based on an invisible criterion. Psychologically, this structure reduces anxiety by simplifying social reality. Relationships are cognitively complex. They require ongoing negotiation, tolerance of ambiguity, and the capacity to hold both positive and negative traits in the same person. When stress is high, this complexity becomes exhausting. A narrative that sorts people into categories aligned versus resistant, supportive versus jealous, offers relief. It replaces uncertainty with certainty. However, this relief comes with trade-offs. When jealousy is framed as spiritual resistance, it becomes non-negotiable. There is no path for repair, conversation, or mutual growth, because resistance is not something to work through, it is something to move away from. This can prematurely foreclose relationships that might otherwise evolve through honest dialogue. The public versus private framing also erodes trust in observable behavior. Normally, humans calibrate trust through consistency over time, words matching actions, patterns stabilizing or changing. When private intention is presumed to be hidden and potentially hostile, no amount of positive behavior can fully restore safety. This can lead to social isolation as the listener narrows their circle to only those who appear entirely non-threatening, a category that shrinks as suspicion grows. Positioning separation as divine protection also shifts agency away from the listener's own relational skills. Boundaries, discernment, and communication are internal capacities that can be developed. When separation is attributed primarily to external protection, the listener may feel less responsible for examining their own patterns, triggers, or contributions to conflict. The narrative protects self-esteem by externalizing relational breakdowns, but it can also stall growth by discouraging self-reflection. It is important to recognize that betrayal does occur and distancing from harmful relationships can be necessary and healthy. The issue is not the acknowledgement of harm, but the framework used to interpret it. When betrayal is assumed rather than demonstrated, when jealousy is spiritualized rather than humanized, and when separation is sacralized rather than contextualized, the listener's social world can become progressively narrower and more polarized. Emotional distancing framed as protection can become a default response rather than a considered choice. Over time, this may increase loneliness and reinforce the belief that being set apart necessarily means being alone. From a psychological perspective, these narratives are compelling because they protect identity during periods of vulnerability. They offer a way to maintain a positive self-concept in the face of relational pain. Instead of concluding, "I was hurt and I don't fully understand why," the listener can conclude, "I was opposed because of who I am becoming." This conclusion preserves meaning and dignity. The challenge is to hold this meaning lightly rather than absolutely. Relationships exist within social, emotional, and contextual systems. People can feel threatened without being malicious. They can act inconsistently without intending betrayal. Smiles can coexist with confusion, insecurity, or ambivalence. Discernment involves tolerating this complexity rather than collapsing it into a single explanatory story. True protection does not require suspicion of all intimacy. It requires the capacity to evaluate behavior over time, communicate boundaries clearly, and differentiate between genuine harm and ordinary relational friction. When separation is necessary, it can be chosen consciously rather than justified cosmically. In this way, the listener retains agency, compassion, and realism simultaneously. Understanding how these narratives function allows individuals to take what is useful, the permission to step back from harmful dynamics without absorbing what is limiting, the belief that closeness inevitably invites betrayal, or that disagreement is proof of spiritual resistance. By recentering authority within lived experience and reflective judgment, protection becomes an internal capacity rather than an external decree, and relationships can be navigated with both caution and openness rather than fear, disguised as destiny. Instructions to comment, affirm, subscribe, or remain engaged operate as more than neutral calls to action when they are embedded within spiritualized or metaphysical language, because they transform ordinary platform behaviors into signals of alignment, belief, and participation in an unseen process. On the surface, these instructions resemble standard media engagement strategies, but when framed as spiritually meaningful acts, they acquire a different psychological weight. The listener is no longer being asked to interact for algorithmic visibility or community building. They are being invited to demonstrate agreement readiness or faith through action. Language that frames engagement as spiritual agreement collapses the distinction between internal reflection and external behavior. Commenting is no longer just expression, it becomes declaration. Affirming is no longer just positive self-talk, it becomes confirmation of truth. Subscribing is no longer convenience, it becomes commitment. Staying engaged is no longer attention, it becomes loyalty. This reframing subtly converts platform mechanics into moral or metaphysical tests. The listener is not simply deciding whether they want more content, they are deciding whether they are aligned or misaligned, responsive or resistant. When words and actions are equated with metaphysical consequence, the stakes of engagement rise dramatically. Typing a phrase, clicking a button, or remaining present is presented as an act that reverberates beyond the immediate context. The implication is that language itself is causal, that speaking or affirming something activates forces, seals outcomes, or signals readiness to receive. This taps into a long-standing human intuition that words matter, that naming creates reality. While language does shape perception and behavior, equating platform actions with cosmic consequence amplifies this intuition into obligation. The listener may feel that failing to comment or affirm is not neutral, but actively blocking their own progress. Silence becomes a choice with consequences. This framing reinforces the idea that passive listening is insufficient. The message often emphasizes that awareness without action is incomplete, that hearing without responding is wasted opportunity. On one level, this can be interpreted as encouragement toward integration rather than consumption. On another level, it creates pressure. The listener is taught that receiving insight without outward demonstration is a form of stagnation or even disobedience. This discourages private processing. Reflection, skepticism, or quiet integration are subtly devalued in favor of visible compliance. The act of engagement becomes proof of seriousness. Creation of behavioral compliance loops emerges from the repetition of this structure. Each piece of content invites engagement, frames it as meaningful, rewards it with reassurance or belonging, and warns implicitly against non-participation. The listener comments or affirms, experiences a small sense of relief or inclusion, and becomes more likely to do so again. Over time, engagement shifts from a choice to a habit, and then from a habit to an expectation. The loop is self-reinforcing because the behavior produces emotional payoff, a feeling of alignment, of being seen, of having done the right thing. This payoff does not depend on the actual content of the engagement. It depends on the act itself. Even generic affirmations feel significant because they fulfill the requirement of response. The language used often reinforces this by thanking those who engage, acknowledging them as attentive, awake, or aligned, while remaining silent about those who do not. This selective reinforcement trains behavior without explicit coercion. Importantly, the compliance loop is not enforced through threat, but through meaning. There is rarely an overt punishment for not engaging. Instead, there is the implication of missed alignment, delayed blessing, or lack of readiness. This is psychologically effective because it preserves the listener's sense of autonomy while steering behavior. The person believes they are choosing to engage, but the choice is structured so that one option feels spiritually congruent and the other feels risky. The loop also externalizes validation. The listener learns to mark internal states through external acts. Feeling aligned is no longer just an internal resonance, it is something confirmed by commenting, affirming, or staying present. This can gradually weaken internal reference points. Instead of asking, "Do I truly understand or resonate with this?" the listener may ask, "Did I respond correctly?" The metric of engagement replaces the metric of understanding. Over time, this can blur the line between genuine integration and performative agreement. Language that ties engagement to consequence often uses immediacy and finality. Phrases implying that this is the moment to act, that words spoken now matter more, then later intensify the loop. The listener is encouraged to respond before thinking too much because thinking is subtly framed as delay. This prioritizes speed over depth. The faster the response, the more aligned it appears. This dynamic mirrors high-pressure sales tactics, but with existential rather than financial stakes. The compliance loop also benefits from social proof. When engagement is visible, seeing others comment or affirm reinforces the norm. The listener perceives participation as common and expected. Non-participation feels isolating. Even if the listener has doubts, the presence of many affirming voices can create the impression that agreement is the default. This further reduces the likelihood of dissent or quiet withdrawal. The loop tightens as engagement becomes identity reinforcing. Those who regularly participate may begin to see themselves as part of an in-group defined by responsiveness and belief. Engagement becomes a marker of belonging. To disengage would not just mean stopping a behavior, it would mean stepping out of a community or self-concept. The loop thus extends beyond individual actions into identity maintenance. It is important to note that none of this requires malicious intent. Many creators genuinely believe that engagement strengthens commitment or helps listeners embody insights. The mechanisms described here are common across marketing, education, religion, and social movements. What matters is not the presence of calls to action, but the way they are framed and the consequences implied. When engagement is framed as optional and exploratory, it supports agency. When it is framed as spiritually necessary or causally potent in a metaphysical sense, it constrains agency while preserving the illusion of choice. Equating words and actions with metaphysical consequence also shifts responsibility. If outcomes depend on whether one commented or affirmed, then lack of progress can be attributed to insufficient engagement rather than to the content's limitations or the complexity of real-life change. This protects the message from critique. If it didn't work, the listener can be told implicitly or explicitly that they did not engage properly. The compliance loop thus becomes self-sealing. Success validates the message. Failure indicts the listener's participation. Reinforcing that passive listening is insufficient also discourages rest. The listener is trained to be constantly responsive. Silence, which can be a space for digestion and discernment, is framed as inertia. This keeps attention tethered to the source. Continuous engagement becomes a way to stay safe, aligned, or progressing. The nervous system remains activated, oriented toward the next prompt, the next affirmation, the next required response. Over time, this can create fatigue masked as devotion. The listener may feel compelled to keep up, to not miss moments, to affirm or agree lest they fall out of alignment. Understanding these dynamics does not require rejecting engagement outright. It requires separating symbolic meaning from behavioral compulsion. Commenting can be expression without being proof. Affirmations can be personal without being performative. Staying engaged can be a choice rather than a test. When listeners reclaim the right to process internally, to agree without declaring, or to step back without consequence, the compliance loop loosens. Engagement becomes informative rather than obligatory. The key distinction is whether action is invited as a support for integration or demanded as evidence of worthiness. When engagement is decoupled from metaphysical consequence, it can serve genuine connection and reflection. When it is tightly coupled, it risks training behavior through pressure rather than understanding. By recognizing how these loops are constructed, individuals can participate consciously, choosing when and how to engage based on resonance and clarity rather than urgency or fear. This restores agency and allows meaning to emerge from lived integration rather than from repeated outward signals that substitute motion for depth. The introduction of a threefold blessing, financial, relational, and spiritual, functions as a highly effective narrative device because it maps neatly onto the three domains most people associate with a whole life: material stability, emotional connection, and inner meaning. By covering all three, the message avoids leaving any major area of longing unaddressed. The listener does not need to translate the promise into relevance. Relevance is already built in. Financial blessing speaks to survival, security, and autonomy. Relational blessing speaks to belonging, validation, and love. Spiritual blessing speaks to purpose, identity, and coherence. Together, they create a sense of total restoration rather than partial improvement. This structure is psychologically powerful because it mirrors the way people internally organize their hopes. Even if one domain is consciously minimized, it is rarely absent. By presenting the blessings as a unified package, the message implies that true resolution cannot be fragmented, it must be comprehensive. The specificity of the outcomes is carefully balanced with flexibility. Financial blessing is described in concrete terms: unexpected money, debt relief opportunities, yet never tied to a single mechanism. Relational blessing is framed as a specific kind of person: peaceful, aligned, non-draining, without specifying when, where, or how they appear. Spiritual blessing is articulated through recognizable experiences, sharper intuition, clearer dreams, heightened discernment, without requiring any particular belief system beyond attentiveness. This combination allows listeners with vastly different lives to map their own situations onto the same promises. Someone struggling with bills can imagine financial relief. Someone feeling lonely can imagine a healing connection. Someone feeling lost can imagine spiritual clarity. Because the outcomes are not falsifiable in the short term, identification remains intact. Even if nothing immediately changes, the listener can always interpret future events as partial fulfillment or delayed manifestation. Framing the rewards as compensation for past suffering further deepens emotional buy-in. Suffering is retroactively given meaning. Pain is no longer random or wasted, it becomes a prerequisite. This reframing is soothing because it resolves cognitive dissonance. If life has been hard, there must be a reason. The promise of compensation answers that need. It suggests a moral balance built into reality, where endurance accumulates credit. Importantly, this compensation is not framed as a transaction the listener consciously entered into, but as something observed and recorded by a higher order. This preserves innocence. The listener did not suffer in order to earn. They suffered because life happened, and now life or heaven or the universe is correcting the imbalance. This removes self-blame and replaces it with anticipation. Past pain becomes evidence of future reward rather than a mark of failure. The assurance that blessings require no further effort is a critical component of the appeal. Many listeners are exhausted not just physically but existentially. They have tried self-improvement strategy, endurance, and adaptation. Promising reward without additional effort feels like rest. It bypasses resistance because it does not ask for more striving. Instead of do better, the message says be ready. This shifts the listener from an action-oriented mode to a receptive one. Readiness is framed as an internal state rather than an external achievement. You do not have to fix yourself, work harder, or prove anything. You simply have to stop resisting, stop doubting, stop holding on to what drains you. This is still a form of action, but it is framed as subtraction rather than addition. Letting go feels easier than building up, especially for someone already depleted. Reinforcing that readiness, not merit, is the key. Further dissolves anxiety around worthiness. Merit implies comparison, judgment, and hierarchy. Readiness implies timing and alignment. You are not being evaluated against others. You are being assessed relative to your own state. This is comforting because it removes competition. There is no leaderboard, no standard to meet, no moral exam to pass. Either you are ready or you are not, and readiness can change quickly. This also creates urgency without invoking guilt. If blessings are about readiness, then hesitation becomes the only obstacle. The listener is encouraged to align now, to open now, to receive now. If nothing happens, it can be interpreted not as a failure of the promise, but as a delay in readiness. This protects the narrative from disconfirmation while maintaining hope. The threefold structure also allows selective focus. A listener may consciously resonate with one blessing while subconsciously absorbing the others. Even if someone dismisses the financial aspect as unlikely, the relational or spiritual aspect may still feel plausible. Accepting one makes it easier to accept all three because they are bundled. The mind rarely rejects a package wholesale if part of it feels true. Over time, repeated exposure can normalize the entire framework. The compensation narrative also subtly discourages critical examination of present conditions. If blessings are coming as recompense, current dissatisfaction becomes temporary by definition. There is less incentive to analyze structural issues, personal boundaries, or systemic causes of suffering. Hope is projected forward. This can be stabilizing in the short term, providing emotional relief, but it also defers agency. The listener waits rather than intervenes. The assurance that no further effort is required reinforces this waiting posture. Effort is reframed as mistrust, striving as misalignment. This can create a paradox where genuine initiative feels like interference. The listener may hesitate to act decisively, fearing they might disrupt the unfolding blessing. The message resolves this tension by redefining action as obedience or release rather than strategy. Doing nothing becomes doing something as long as it is framed correctly. Readiness becomes a moralized state. To be ready is to be open, grateful, trusting, and non-resistant. These are all internal qualities that are difficult to measure objectively, which makes self-assessment unstable. The listener may continually check themselves for signs of readiness, scanning emotions and thoughts for doubt or fear. This internal monitoring keeps attention engaged with the framework. At the same time, because readiness is not merit-based, the listener is reassured that imperfection is allowed. You do not need to be healed, disciplined, or enlightened. You just need to be willing. This lowers the barrier to entry. Almost anyone can consider themselves willing, at least momentarily. The threefold blessing thus becomes universally accessible. It does not privilege intelligence, morality, education, or social status. It privileges receptivity. This universality is a major source of its appeal. It allows listeners to feel included without changing who they are. Finally, the structure creates a narrative arc that feels complete. Past suffering explains present confusion. Present readiness unlocks future blessing. Financial, relational, and spiritual rewards resolve the core tensions of survival, belonging, and meaning. The listener is positioned at the threshold of resolution. Nothing essential is missing. This sense of completeness can be deeply soothing, especially for those whose lives feel fragmented. The message does not just promise improvement, it promises coherence. By offering compensation without effort and readiness without merit, it tells the listener that the hardest part is already over. All that remains is to accept. That acceptance, framed as simple and immediate, feels attainable even in moments of exhaustion. The power of the threefold blessing lies not in any single promise, but in how the promises work together to neutralize doubt, fatigue, and self-judgment simultaneously. The prediction of dreams, numbers, and synchronicities operates as a preemptive interpretive framework rather than a forecast in the ordinary sense, because its primary function is not to describe what will happen, but to define how whatever happens will be understood. By naming specific categories of future experience, unusual dreams, repeating numbers, symbolic coincidences, the narrative creates a menu of phenomena that are both common enough to occur naturally and vague enough to absorb a wide range of subjective events. Almost everyone dreams. Almost everyone encounters numbers daily. Almost everyone occasionally notices coincidences. By predicting these in advance, the message does not need to cause new experiences. It only needs to redirect attention toward experiences that would have occurred anyway. This is where pre-interpretation becomes central. The moment a future event is framed ahead of time as meaningful validation, its interpretive outcome is already determined before it occurs. When a listener later wakes from a vivid dream, notices a number sequence, or experiences an odd coincidence, the question of what it means has already been answered for them. The event is no longer neutral data, it is confirmation. This removes ambiguity, which is psychologically relieving. Ambiguity demands effort and interpretation. Confirmation offers closure. The instruction to notice and affirm repeating symbols further tightens this loop. Attention is not passive. When attention is directed towards specific patterns, the brain's salience network begins filtering reality differently. Stimuli that previously passed unnoticed now stand out. This is not because reality has changed, but because the filtering mechanism has. Once a person is told to look for something, especially something emotionally charged, detection rates increase dramatically. Each detection then reinforces the belief that something unusual is happening. The act of affirmation, mentally or verbally acknowledging the symbol, adds another layer. Affirmation turns observation into participation. The listener is no longer merely noticing, they are responding. This response creates a sense of dialogue between the individual and their environment. The world feels less inert, more communicative. That feeling can be compelling, especially for individuals who have felt unseen or unheard. The reinforcement loop between perception and belief works as follows. Belief directs attention. Attention increases perceived frequency. Perceived frequency strengthens belief. Once established, this loop is self-sustaining. Importantly, it does not require deception or conscious fabrication. The experiences feel real because they are real experiences of noticing. What changes is not the external world, but the internal weighting of significance. By predicting these experiences in advance, the narrative inoculates itself against doubt. When the listener encounters the predicted phenomena, the message appears accurate. When they do not, the absence can be explained as a matter of timing, readiness, or attentiveness. Either way, the framework remains intact. Anticipation plays a key role in strengthening narrative coherence. When future experiences are named ahead of time, the listener's timeline is subtly reorganized. The present moment becomes a preparation phase, and the near future becomes a validation phase. This gives the narrative a forward pull. The listener is not just reflecting on what they have heard. They are waiting for something to happen. Waiting itself is engaging. It keeps the message alive beyond the moment of delivery. Each new day becomes an opportunity for confirmation. This also reframes mundane experiences. A vivid dream is no longer just a dream, it is a signal. A number on a clock is no longer just a number, it is a message. A coincidence is no longer random, it is alignment. This reframing provides emotional relief through coherence. Life feels less chaotic when events can be fitted into a story. Even uncertainty becomes meaningful uncertainty. The narrative does not need to predict specific outcomes, it only needs to predict interpretive categories. This is far more robust. Specific predictions risk falsification. Interpretive predictions absorb variability. The listener is instructed not just to notice, but to notice in a particular way. This is crucial. Without instruction, noticing can lead to curiosity or skepticism. With instruction, noticing leads to affirmation. The act of affirming reinforces identity. I am someone who sees this. Over time, this can shift self-concept from passive observer to attuned participant. The narrative coherence is strengthened because disparate experiences, dreams, numbers, feelings, coincidences are woven into a single explanatory thread. Instead of fragmenting experience, the framework unifies it. This unity is emotionally stabilizing, especially for individuals who feel internally scattered. The anticipation of signs also creates a sense of being guided without requiring explicit instruction. The world itself appears to offer feedback. This reduces reliance on external authorities while paradoxically deepening reliance on the original narrative that defined the signs. The listener may feel increasingly autonomous while actually remaining anchored to the same interpretive lens. The prediction of synchronicities also leverages hindsight bias. Once an event occurs, it is easy to remember that it was predicted even if the prediction was broad. Memory smooths over vagueness and sharpens perceived accuracy. Over time, the listener may accumulate a personal archive of confirmations, each reinforcing the sense that the narrative fits their life. This personal evidence feels stronger than abstract argument. It is lived, not theoretical. The instruction to affirm repeating symbols adds a ritual element. Ritual stabilizes meaning through repetition. Each affirmation is a small act of commitment. Commitment increases consistency. Consistency strengthens belief. None of this requires overt coercion. The process feels organic because it operates through ordinary cognitive mechanisms: attention, pattern recognition, memory, and emotion. By anticipating future experiences and assigning them meaning in advance, the narrative effectively colonizes the interpretive space of the listener's near future. Whatever happens can be folded back into the story. This is what gives the framework its resilience. It does not collapse under scrutiny because it is not making testable claims about the external world. It is shaping the internal experience of noticing. The result is a closed but emotionally coherent system in which belief and perception continually reinforce each other, and the sense of meaning grows not from new information but from the reorganization of attention itself.